War is raging worldwide. Whether it's an Israeli aerial bombing of Gaza, an explosion in Syria, or a drone strike in Pakistan, there seems to be a commonality among the unceasing violence. The weapons being used almost always carry the seal of the United States. Not that this should come as a surprise, considering how the U.S. is notorious for its military-industrial complex and is the premier manufacturer and exporter of weapons of war. In fact, the U.S. spends more on defense than countries with the next 10 highest budgets combined. Yet with so much U.S. artillery being pumped into practically every country in the world, it's nearly impossible to prevent American armament from ending up in the wrong hands. And wouldn't you know it, just this week it was reported that the Islamist militant group ISIS effectively captured 52 American-made artillery cannons with a price tag of $500,000 each. That's right, the weapons in question are M198 howitzers, capable of shelling targets up to 20 miles away. These massive cannons also have GPS targeting systems, meaning that as ISIS continues its bombardment through central Iraq, its force will only be stronger. But ISIS fighters aren't the only ones benefiting from U.S. arms. Recently, I reported that as the latest siege on Gaza continues to unfold, Israel has been using experimental weapons on Palestinians. Dense inert metal explosives, or dime weapons, have been used by Israel against Palestinians before, thanks in part to the U.S. Air Force, which developed the weapon technology back in 2006 before sharing it with America's closest ally in the Middle East. Dime weapons create immense energy when detonated, causing deep burns to the skin, muscles, and even bone. Beyond that, survivors of dime blasts carry a high risk of developing cancer, according to Mads Gilbert, a Norwegian doctor who's reported on the effects these weapons have had on Palestinian civilians. Moving on to Syria, where the U.S. government has long debated arming opposition groups on the ground, worrying that U.S. weapons could fall into the wrong hands. Well, guess what? They did. Not only are ISIS and al-Qaeda now armed with U.S.-grade artillery, but pro-Assad militias have now been seen carrying brand new weapons made in the USA, including automatic rifles and grenade launchers. Even though the civil war in Syria has more than two sides fighting each other, U.S. weapons are now being used by all the players involved. Moving on to the Egyptian uprising, where U.S.-backed dictator Hosni Mubarak brutally cracked down on protesters, causing mass slaughter and injury of civilians. The weapons used to carry out that barbarism, including tear gas canisters and grenades, were all American-made. Beyond the Middle East, though, militant groups in Africa are also benefiting from U.S. weapons that are apparently just up for grabs. As Western forces built up counterterrorism operations in countries like Mauritania, Niger, Mali, and elsewhere, last year, Defense News reported that militia fighters raided a Libyan base that housed a U.S. weapons arsenal. By sunrise, fighters had stolen several U.S. military vehicles and hundreds of U.S.-made automatic weapons and equipment. But of course, none of this is new, because whether it be directly or indirectly, there are too many instances to count where U.S. weapons have made it into the hands of our so-called adversaries. Like in the 1980s, when U.S. weapons were provided to soldiers in Iraq and Panama, as well as so-called freedom fighters in Afghanistan, who would later become members of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Look, nothing is more at odds with America's alleged crusade to rid the world of terrorists than the fact that America continues to be the world's leader in arming the world. As long as this is the case, this strategy will only continue to empower human rights abusers and cause widespread death and destruction, all stamped with Made in the USA.